They say silence is harmless, but step into the frozen woods of remote America in 1910 and silence becomes a weapon. Imagine this: a two-story farmhouse, its windows blackened not by night, but by boards nailed from the inside. No voices, no laughter, not even the ordinary creak of floorboards. Locals claimed that for 3 long years, no one saw a single member of the Blackwood family leave that house. Be part of this journey. Subscribe right now and comment below the topic that deserves the spotlight in the next video. Also, tell me from which city and at what time you're watching this video. Now, the only proof of life was smoke rising occasionally from the chimney. A strange, thin smoke that carried an odor no one could place. Sweet, acrid, almost metallic. Then, one night in November, a storm cracked the valley in half. A tree came down across the roof, forcing open the attic window. What the neighbors glimpsed when lightning flashed through the storm was enough to make grown men cross themselves. 4 pale faces pressed against the glass, wide-eyed, watching, not with fear, but with hunger. What followed is one of the darkest chapters of American isolation, a family that descended into a shared madness so complete, so ritualized, that history itself tried to bury their existence. The Blackwoods weren't killers in the ordinary sense. They were participants in something older, stranger, a kind of psychological contagion that took root when you mix isolation, secrecy, and inherited corruption. In the hills where they lived, whispers spread of chanting after midnight, of lights moving in perfect circles in the fields, and of livestock drained not of blood, but of something deeper: vitality, spirit, essence. Authorities? They looked away. The county was too remote, too poor, too inconsequential for state officials to care. That left the locals, who began crossing the Mizelles whenever they passed the Blackwood property, refusing even to say the family's name after dark. Some swore the land itself was cursed, a place where compasses spun and time staggered. Others said the Blackwoods carried a European madness, an inheritance smuggled across the ocean with their ancestors, planted like a seed that finally blossomed in the silence of the American frontier. Tonight, I'll take you inside that house, inside their descent, and show you what happens when the mind becomes a weapon turned inward. Because the Blackwood story isn't just a tale of one family, it's a warning about what waits in every man if he stares too long into isolation, if he listens too closely to the silence. The storm that cracked open the Blackwood house was only the beginning. For once, the illusion of their perfect secrecy was broken. Rumors that had been festering for years began to seep through the community like poison. At first it was dismissed as backwoods superstition, the kind of gossip poor farmers spin to explain their own failures. But the details were too consistent, too sharp, and too many witnesses swore to seeing things no sane man could invent. Children who wandered too close to the Blackwood fence came back muttering about voices carried on the wind, voices not spoken but whispered inside their heads, commanding them to be still. Hunters swore that deer would not cross the property's edge, that foxes turned back, and that birds never nested in the crooked orchard behind the house. And then came the reports of lanterns glowing from inside the barn long after midnight, where no horses had been kept for years, lanterns that seemed to swing in slow, perfect rhythm, as if marking time to music no one outside could hear. When an itinerant preacher dared to stop at the farmhouse one Sunday, he left before dusk, pale and trembling, muttering that the family had made a church where no God would enter. He would never speak of what he saw inside, and 2 weeks later he disappeared altogether, his Bible found on the edge of the Blackwood property, open to the book of Revelation. Yet the sheriff refused to act, and the townsfolk chose silence, for in those remote valleys of early 20th century America, law bent easily under the weight of fear. And so the Blackwoods continued, untouched and unchallenged, living in a silence that was no longer absence of sound, but presence of something else, something watching, something binding, a madness that did not belong to any one of them alone but seemed to breathe through them as one body. This is where the story shifts from family tragedy to something more dangerous, because madness shared is no longer madness. It is a system, a doctrine, a control. And what the Blackwoods created inside that boarded farmhouse was a system so complete, so disciplined, that it rivaled any institution, any cult, any machine of psychological domination. It was here, in isolation, that they forged a new kind of madness, one that thrived not on delusion alone, but on obedience, secrecy, and the erasure of identity itself. By the spring of 1911, the Blackwoods had already become less a family in the traditional sense and more a closed organism, a hive sealed from the world, each member reflecting the will of the others, as though individuality itself had been drained out and replaced by a collective pulse. The few outsiders who claimed to glimpse them described a strange sameness that was more unnerving than any deformity. Movements too synchronized, voices that overlapped as if rehearsed, and eyes that never seemed to blink at the proper intervals. A neighbor's hired hand once recounted, after too much whiskey loosened his tongue, that he had seen the four sons working in the fields at dusk, turning the soil not with the rhythm of farmers, but with the precision of soldiers, every swing of the hoe rising and falling in perfect unison, their heads tilted slightly toward the darkening woods, as if listening for a signal no one else could hear. He fled the valley within the week, refusing to return even for his wages. And yet, even with these accounts, the county records show nothing, no arrests, no investigations, not even a formal complaint, because what happens in the far edges of civilization has always belonged to silence. But silence is fertile ground, and in that soil the Blackwoods grew rituals that bound them together and severed them from the world outside. They stopped trading in town, sending instead notes written in cramped script, demanding supplies to be left on the edge of their property, payment in coins so old that some bore the faces of long-dead monarchs, suggesting that the family's wealth was not earned in America, but carried from older soil across the Atlantic. Farmers who dared handle those coins swore they were colder than normal, as though they had never absorbed heat from the sun. Over time, even the smallest children in the valley were warned never to speak the Blackwood name aloud after dark, because every story carried the same final warning, that the family listened, that they heard not with ears, but with something else. This is where their legend mutates into something more insidious, because madness contained within four walls is one thing, but madness that listens to you, that adapts to you, becomes a form of control. And it is here that the Blackwoods stopped being a cautionary tale and began to resemble a structure we see repeated throughout history, a family as an institution as a prison, and a prison as a tool of power. What made the Blackwoods so dangerous was not simply their secrecy, but the way their madness echoed patterns found in the most disciplined and corrupt institutions of power. A family turned into a fortress, where each member was both prisoner and jailer, each role rehearsed until individuality dissolved into ritual. Records from a traveling merchant in 1912 describe how the family's daughters, veiled and silent, came to the road only once that year to collect bundles of salt, candles and thick rope, their hands gloved even in the heat of July, their gestures slow, precise, as though every movement had been dictated beforehand. They left without a word, and yet the merchant swore he felt as if a message had been delivered directly into his mind. Do not return. He never did. And still the Blackwoods endured, protected not by strength or wealth, but by the paralysis of those around them, by the instinctive human urge to look away from what disturbs too deeply. This is how corruption always survives, not in the shadows alone, but in the silence of those who refuse to confront it. But inside the boarded farmhouse, something else was happening, something more structured than isolation. The family's rituals began to align with the cycles of the moon, their smoke rising thicker during new moons, their fields left untended for weeks only to be tilled furiously in 3-day bursts, always at night. Witnesses who lived long enough to speak of it claimed that faint chants carried across the valley in those hours, chants without words, only a droning hum, like breath weaponized into rhythm. And the deeper one listens to these accounts, the clearer it becomes that the Blackwoods were not simply victims of hereditary madness, but engineers of their own system of control, drawing from patterns older than America itself. Every great institution, church, state, army, thrives on repetiti, on secrecy and obedience, and the Blackwoods mirrored these mechanisms with terrifying accuracy, building their own micro-empire in the wilderness. By 1913, even the land bore their signature, paths grown into spirals where the grass refused to die, carved symbols at the edges of fence posts, and a strange absence of animal bones anywhere near their home, as though scavengers dared not feed within the Blackwood boundary. This is the moment where folklore and forbidden history fuse, because what you see in the Blackwoods is not just madness, it is a family turning isolation into doctrine, creating the same machine of psychological control that elites, rulers, and hidden powers have always wielded, only here distilled into its purest, most terrifying form. By the winter of 1914, the Blackwoods' dominion over their secluded hollow had grown into something that resembled less a family and more a closed order, a monastery without God, a cult without outsiders. Neighbors, those few still willing to live within 5 miles, spoke of nights when no firelight appeared from the farmhouse windows, yet the valley itself seemed to glow faintly with a dull phosphorescence, as though the very soil had swallowed flame and was exhaling it back into the night air. Travelers who attempted to cut through Blackwood land never returned with the same clarity of mind. One coal miner, found wandering barefoot along the Pike Road, raved that he had seen faces in the dirt, moving beneath the roots, whispering through the stones. Doctors diagnosed exhaustion, but exhaustion does not etch symbols into the skin, and yet his arms bore spirals carved as if by a trembling but deliberate hand. This was the era when whispers began to spread that the Blackwoods had unearthed something beneath their land, that their rituals were not merely inherited superstition, but communion with whatever slept beneath those mountains. And still, no authority intervened. The sheriff of the county was said to avoid even mentioning their name in official reports, and when the state surveyors came to chart the region, their notes curiously omitted all mention of the Blackwood homestead, as if the land had been redacted from the record. Silence was not passive. It was active protection. The Blackwoods flourished because they understood what every hidden power understands. Fear breeds complicity, and complicity breeds longevity. In their seclusion, they perfected their rites, building a calendar not of Christian holidays or civic markers, but of blood moons, solstices, equinoxes, moments when the veil between time and eternity thinned. On those nights, witnesses at the farthest ridges reported drums, faint but steady, always accompanied by the same inhuman humming, the same vibration that caused windows to shiver and dogs to howl until their throats tore. It was not mere madness. It was structure, a discipline so precise that its echoes reached beyond their valley and into the minds of those too weak to resist it. And so, by 1915, the Blackwoods had become more than a rumor, more than a curse. They were an institution unto themselves, their name whispered like an infection, a contagion of silence, proof that power does not always need armies or gold to endure. Sometimes all it needs is a family willing to turn themselves into a machine, running on secrecy, fear, and a devotion to forces older than history itself. By the spring of 1916, even the mountain itself seemed to bear the weight of the Blackwoods' dominion, as if the land had surrendered its will to them, bending, cracking, and reshaping itself in unnatural ways that left those who dared approach with the feeling that they were trespassing into something not meant for human habitation. Trees grew in warped spirals around the perimeter of the hollow, their trunks twisted as though straining away from some invisible gravity pulling at their roots. Streams that once ran clear now carried a faint reddish tint, and livestock belonging to neighbors who grazed too close to Blackwood land were found gutted, their eyes wide open, their tongues cut out cleanly as if for ritual preservation. Those who whispered about these atrocities were quickly silenced, not by law, but by fear, for everyone in the county knew the sheriff's son had once gone courting a Blackwood girl and returned weeks later with his jaw permanently locked and his eyes empty of expression, a hollow man who never again spoke a word. There were rumors, too, of something larger happening beneath the farmhouse, that the family had tunneled deep into the bedrock, creating chambers and altars where fire burned without smoke, where voices chanted in languages older than the Bible, where the dead were not buried but transformed into vessels of continuity, their bones used to map constellations on dirt floors, their marrow drained and stored as if it were wine. When the war overseas filled newspapers with reports of slaughter in Europe, the Blackwoods paid no mind. Their war was not against nations but against the ticking clock of mortality, against the limitations of flesh. And so, as the world bled, the hollow remained untouched, a fortress of silence and ritual. It was then that outsiders began to vanish more frequently. Peddlers, deserters, a census taker who thought had himself bold enough to knock upon their door, all swallowed by that valley without trace, absorbed into the Blackwoods lineage, whether through death, ritual, or something far stranger. What made this silence unbearable for those who lived near was not only the fear of what was happening, but the knowledge that the world beyond would never acknowledge it. No paper printed these disappearances, no church sermon condemned the Blackwoods by name, no official document so much as recorded their crimes. They existed in the blind spot of history, proof that darkness does not need secrecy when it has indifference as its ally. And so the hollow grew darker, more alive, a place where time and flesh twisted together, where the Blackwoods' rituals pressed deeper into forces too immense for language, ensuring that by the time anyone dared confront them, it would already be too late. By the end of that same year, the hollow had become something no longer bound by the ordinary passing of seasons. For while the rest of the county withered under drought and failing harvests, the Blackwoods' land remained unnaturally fertile, bearing crops of such size and color that those who glimpsed them from a distance swore the vegetables bled when cut, and the fruits dripped with juices too dark to be mistaken for anything natural. Children, too, were said to grow differently in that family, born small and with fragile limbs, yet by the age of 3 walking and speaking in full sentences, their voices too deep, their eyes carrying the weight of generations before them, as though the souls of the dead were folded back into the living. Neighbors who once dared to spy upon the Blackwoods described hearing lullabies sung at midnight, not to babies, but to the hollow itself, a low hum like a hive, carrying through the trees until it vibrated in the chest of anyone who listened too long. Those who lived on the mountain's edge began to board their windows, to leave offerings of milk, salt, or even their own blood at the forked path leading down into the valley, not out of devotion but out of necessity, believing that ignoring the Blackwoods was more dangerous than acknowledging them. And still the disappearances mounted, hunters who crossed property lines, widows who lived alone, even a preacher from across the ridge who claimed he would drive the family out with the hand of God, and instead returned a week later crawling on all fours, naked, gnawing at the bark of trees until he died frothing like a rabid dog. These events were not accidents. They were warnings, deliberate demonstrations that the Blackwoods' power was not only ritual but contagious, capable of warping the human mind until men forgot their own names. Behind the farmhouse, where the earth rose into a snow-tinted hill, neighbors swore the outline of a great door could be seen, etched not by tools, but by the living soil itself, an archway that opened on certain nights when the family gathered in silence, carrying lanterns that did not flicker with fire, but with a steady glow like the phosphorescence of rotting wood. What they brought through that door, no one knew. But the next morning the air always hung heavy with the stench of iron, and the ground trembled faintly as though something vast had shifted beneath it. In those days, even the bravest no longer asked who the Blackwoods were, but what they had become, for it was clear that whatever blood flowed in their veins no longer answered to the same God as the rest of men. By the autumn of 1917, the Blackwoods' isolation had transformed into a fully realized dominion, a world apart from the rest of human civilization, where time, morality, and identity bent beneath the weight of their rituals. Outsiders who wandered too close spoke of an air that felt thick and viscous, as though moving through it required a conscious effort to lift one's own limbs, and sounds, footsteps, voices, even the wind, seemed to slow, distorted by a presence that belonged to the house itself. That year, a surveyor from the county arrived to map property boundaries, expecting a simple inspection, only to return days later hollow-eyed and incoherent, claiming that the family had appeared in every room simultaneously, watching him, judging him, even though he swore he had never seen them move. He disappeared entirely the next morning, leaving only a notebook filled with diagrams of spirals, circles, and letters that no scholar could decipher. Locals whispered that the family's children, though small in number, had begun to act as extensions of the parents' will, moving in silence through the woods at dusk, sometimes returning with small, twitching animals they laid before the house as offerings or experiments. There were reports of strange symbols drawn into the frost on windows, handprints appearing where no hands could reach, and a soft, persistent humming that carried for miles across the valley, unsettling livestock and humans alike. The Blackwoods' authority had become absolute, not through threat of punishment, not through coercion in the ordinary sense, but through the slow, deliberate shaping of perception itself. To step onto their land was to enter another reality, a domain where fear itself had substance, where madness and control intertwined so completely that the mind could not disentangle them. And yet the family never left the house, never ventured in, to town, and yet everyone felt their presence everywhere, in every shadow, every gust of wind, every whispered rumor. Theirs was not merely a madness contained, but a contagion, a living doctrine of fear and obedience that spread without touch, without spoken word, until the entire valley had adapted to their rule. By now, even lawmen approached with hesitation, armed not with badges but with superstition, for it had become clear that the Blackwoods operated on rules older than the county, older than the nation, rules that bound nature, mind, and blood alike. This was no longer a story about a family gone insane. It was a study in power itself, distilled into flesh and bone, a reminder that isolation and secrecy are weapons that can turn ordinary humans into instruments of forces far beyond comprehension. By the spring of 1918, the Blackwoods' influence had shifted from subtle terror to direct manipulation, and the valley itself seemed to conspire in their schemes, its mist thickening at the edges of the property, rising like smoke from the soil to shield their movements from prying eyes. Hunters who had once skirted the hollow began returning with stories of trails that looped back upon themselves, as if the land itself had been rearranged overnight, forcing them into the family's presence whether they wished it or not. That year, a traveling merchant carrying supplies from the nearest town tried to confront the family, hoping to negotiate for safe passage and fair payment. But when he arrived at the edge of the property, he found the gates wide open and the house empty, save for a single candle burning in a window. He approached, and the door swung shut behind him before he could reach it, trapping him inside what appeared to be a normal parlor. But the walls pulsed subtly, like a living organism, and the mirrors reflected not his own image, but that of a boy he had known who had vanished in those woods years earlier. Panic overtook him, and he stumbled back, only to find that the path he had entered now led uphill, not toward town, but back into the heart of the hollow, where the youngest Blackwoods, no older than 12, stood waiting in silence, their eyes black with a comprehension far beyond their years. They did not speak, yet he felt every command, every warning sinking into his bones, shaping his fear, bending his mind. When he finally stumbled free hours later, the town's clock had advanced by days, though only hours had passed in his experience, and he could not explain how his satchel had been emptied of goods, leaving behind only the same ancient coins the family used for trade. By now, it was clear that the Blackwoods were no longer merely a family. They had become a network of perception and control, a system that reached beyond walls and fences into minds and bodies, bending reality itself to their will. And the valley, the isolation, the silence of the law, all conspired to reinforce their power, creating a feedback loop of fear and obedience that could only escalate, leaving anyone who crossed them with the sense that the earth itself remembered their trespass. This was not accidental. Every disappearance, every strange event, every unsettling vision had been carefully calibrated over decades to produce one thing: absolute dominion. And the most terrifying part was that this dominion required no violence to maintain. It was embedded in the very fabric of perception, a psychological control system older than any government, older than any religion, perfected by a family who understood its mechanics as instinctively as a predator understands hunger. By the autumn of 1919, the Blackwoods rituals had evolved into a precise machinery of psychological terror, where every sound, every shadow, and every silence was orchestrated to reinforce the hierarchy of fear they maintained within the hollow. Family members no longer needed to raise their voices. Their intentions, their judgments, their punishments traveled invisibly through the air, felt by those who entered the domain before a single word was spoken. The children, trained from birth, acted as extensions of the adult's will, appearing unexpectedly in corners, watching silently, reporting behaviors that could later be corrected with subtle yet unmistakable consequences. Outsiders who observed from a distance described seeing the eldest son moving through the fields at dawn with a long rod, tracing patterns in the soil that no map could decode, patterns that seemed to vibrate in the feet of those who walked across them, an unseen rhythm that unsettled the mind long after the eyes had left the scene. Inside the farmhouse, the walls themselves were arranged to disorient, hallways extending farther than they should, rooms appearing where none had been before, furniture shifting subtly between visits to create the impression that reality itself was under the family's control. Visitors, rare as they were, spoke of clocks that never kept time, of mirrors that reflected not the present but moments from days past, and of whispers that carried personal secrets back to the listener with precision that made casual conversation impossible. Every meal, every chore, every interaction was a lesson in obedience. Even the most mundane activities became instruments of control, training both family members and victims to internalize the rules of the hollow without conscious awareness. By now, the Blackwoods' isolation had produced something far more terrifying than mere insanity. A living, breathing system of dominance that exploited instinct, fear, and perception to ensure compliance without overt force. And as the years pressed on, those who had lived near the hollow spoke not only of fear, but of inevitability, that the Blackwoods were neither seen nor stopped, because their presence had become embedded in the landscape of the mind, a psychological contagion infecting all who approached. To encounter them was to lose certainty, to feel the boundaries of oneself blur, and to recognize that power could exist without physical weapons, without armies, and without law. The Blackwoods had mastered the most dangerous truth. Control over perception is indistinguishable from control over reality itself. By the winter of 1920, the Blackwoods had perfected the first disappearances that relied entirely on their psychological dominion, eliminating outsiders without a trace and without traditional violence, their methods so subtle that suspicion never coalesced into investigation. A local hunter named Eli Thompson, known for his bravery and stubbornness, approached the hollow one snowy evening, determined to map the Blackwoods land for the county surveyors. He reported following a well-worn path, only to find it looping impossibly back on itself, the same trees and rocks appearing in patterns that should have been impossible, as if the earth itself had been folded to contain him. When he finally saw the farmhouse through the drifting snow, it seemed to pulse with life, its windows glowing faintly despite the storm, and a low, persistent hum emanated from the walls, vibrating in his chest and clouding his thoughts. Inside, he claimed to encounter no one directly, yet every room seemed alive, arranging itself around him, shifting so that doors led to new hallways and mirrors reflected events he had no memory of experiencing. He described glimpses of the Blackwood children moving silently, appearing only in peripheral vision, their eyes too knowing, their faces pale and stern, communicating commands without speaking, directing him to leave the house in a manner he could not resist. Hours, or perhaps days, passed in that house, he could not tell which, until he stumbled out into the snow, unsure if he had been gone for moments or weeks. The townsfolk found him days later wandering near the ridge, disoriented, muttering about the house that breathes, his hands clawed, his memory fractured. In the days following, the hunter disappeared entirely, leaving only faint footprints that led into the snow and never emerged. The county dismissed the story as madness brought on by exposure, and fear. Yet those who lived nearby whispered that the Blackwoods had done what they always did, control reality without leaving evidence, demonstrating that the most potent terror is the one that shapes perception, bending minds until obedience is instinctive. By now, the pattern was clear. The family did not need weapons, cages, or chains. They had constructed a psychological fortress, a system in which the very landscape, the passage of time, and the mind of the intruder all worked in unison to enforce the rules of the Hollow. The disappearances were both lesson and warning, a signal that crossing the Blackwoods was not merely dangerous, but impossible, for they had long ago claimed authority over the intangible, the human will itself, bending it, fracturing it, and folding it into their labyrinth of control. By the spring of 1921, the internal hierarchy of the Blackwoods had become a meticulously codified system, where each member of the family, from the eldest patriarch to the youngest child, played a precise role in maintaining their dominion over both the Hollow and anyone who dared approach it. The eldest, Silas Blackwood, was the architect of the psychological structures, devising rituals that intertwined fear, anticipation, and obedience into a single living mechanism. His instructions, never spoken aloud, traveled through subtle gestures, glances, and the children, who acted as extensions of his will. The women of the family, equally disciplined, managed the rhythms of daily life, using chores, meals, and social interactions to train perception, shaping how reality was experienced within the Hollow. Even play was ritualized. The children learned to anticipate threat and reward, understanding that every movement, every sound, every pause could have consequences far beyond what any outsider could perceive. Neighbors who observed from the edges of the property reported seeing the family gather silently in the snow or fog, standing in precise formations that mirrored constellations, humming in tones that caused both animals and humans to shiver, a resonance that seemed to communicate directives to the Hollow itself. When outsiders attempted to intervene, surveyors, wandering hunters, or the occasional curious townsman, they found themselves disoriented in ways that defied natural explanation. Compasses spinning, paths bending impossibly, and the very air seeming to resist their movement. Within the house, walls shifted subtly, hallways extended or contracted overnight, and mirrors reflected not only the present, but fragments of past transgressions, ensuring that any who entered internalized the rules without explicit enforcement. Over time, the family's control became so complete that even the mind of the intruder became a tool of the Blackwoods, their fear and confusion reinforcing the architecture of dominance they had created. By now, the hollow was less a home and more a living organism, responsive to the family's will, an extension of their psychological control, capable of isolating, manipulating, and ultimately erasing those who trespassed. And as the years passed, the town itself came to tacitly acknowledge the family's power, leaving the hollow and its occupants to their quiet, terrifying order, understanding instinctively that to challenge them was to confront something that transcended human law, morality, and even sanity. By the summer of 1922, the Blackwoods orchestrated what would become the first fully documented full-scale disappearance of an outsider, a man named Jonas Harper, a wandering logger known for his defiance and curiosity, whose confidence led him too close to the hollow's perimeter. Harper had been seen by neighbors speaking arrogantly about debunking the myths surrounding the Blackwoods, claiming that the family's reputation was built on superstition and fear, not reality. But the hollow had other designs. On the night he crossed the threshold, the wind shifted, carrying the faint but unmistakable hum of the family's ritual into his mind before he could identify its source, pressing on him like water filling a vessel too small to contain it. Trees bent subtly in his path, shadows elongated and twisted into impossible angles, and the snow beneath his boots seemed to resist, clinging as if to slow his escape. Inside the hollow, he encountered the family as if by chance. Yet every glance, every gesture was calibrated, a silent conversation that compelled him to follow instructions he could not articulate, to trust patterns he could not understand. Hours, or days, passed in a disorienting loop. Hallways folded back on themselves, mirrors reflected moments of fear and regret he could not recall, and the air carried whispers of his own thoughts, spoken aloud, eroding the distinction between his mind and the hollow's influence. When he tried to flee, the children appeared at unexpected intersections, blocking paths or guiding him back through corridors that had no logical connection, their eyes deep and knowing, communicating commands that bypassed language entirely. By the time he was found, or perhaps allowed to leave, the man's mind was fractured, speechless, and hollow-eyed, muttering only fragments of instructions and warnings, never able to convey the full mechanics of what had occurred. His possessions were untouched, yet the very perception of time and space had been manipulated beyond recognition, leaving him permanently altered, a living testament to the Blackwoods' mastery of psychological control. This event marked a turning point, not merely for the family, but for the surrounding community, as it became clear that their dominion did not require overt violence. They had weaponized perception itself, bending reality and the human mind into instruments of obedience, setting the stage for disappearances that would no longer leave any witnesses capable of recounting the horror. By the autumn of 1923, the Blackwoods' methods of conditioning had reached a level of precision that defied conventional understanding, creating a system in which every member of the family and every unfortunate outsider was gradually molded into obedience without overt coercion. Children were raised in a constant state of heightened awareness, taught from infancy to perceive the subtlest shifts in expression, tone, and posture, understanding instinctively which movements pleased the elders and which invited consequences that could manifest without warning. Daily life within the hollow was structured to reinforce this training. Meals were ritualized, chores were timed and observed, and even the seemingly casual passage through hallways became a lesson in attention, patience, and submission. The adults employed similar strategies on outsiders, exploiting isolation, sensory manipulation, and carefully measured fear to erode resistance. Hallways and rooms were deliberately disorienting, mirrors and windows positioned to confuse perception and subtle auditory cues. Low humming, faint footsteps, whispers in the dark, worked to bend attention, making those who entered question their memory, their senses, and ultimately their own judgment. The family's influence extended beyond the house. The surrounding land itself seemed alive with their will, Paths shifted, snow and fog rearranged mysteriously, and animals behaved unnaturally when in proximity, signaling to the intruder that the hollow's dominion extended everywhere. Visitors soon discovered that questioning or resisting only strengthened the control, as the Blackwoods had designed their rituals so that fear and compliance fed one another, creating a feedback loop that embedded obedience in the very psyche of those trapped within the hollow. Over time, the town recognized these patterns, though few spoke openly, realizing that the family's mastery was not supernatural, but methodical, a deliberate and terrifying exercise in psychological engineering. By then, the hollow had become a crucible of domination, an ecosystem in which the boundaries of reality, fear, and control were inseparable, and every step taken within it reinforced the authority of a family who had transcended ordinary power, crafting a kingdom that existed not through brute force, but through the manipulation of perception itself, a force so complete that even the boldest minds faltered and the most determined spirits bent before it. By the winter of 1924, whispers began to emerge of those who had come dangerously close to escaping the Blackwoods hollow, only to find themselves ensnared once more, as if the very air conspired to return them to the family's dominion. One such case involved a young man named Samuel Price, a woodsman from a neighboring county who had wandered too near the property while tracking deer. He recounted being drawn by a strange glow emanating from the house, a light that seemed both welcoming and commanding, impossible to resist. Once inside, time became fluid. Hours melted into days, corridors rearranged themselves, and familiar objects appeared in unfamiliar places, disorienting his sense of reality. Samuel's own thoughts betrayed him. He would begin to act on impulses he could not explain, moving in patterns the family anticipated, guided by subtle gestures from the Blackwoods children, who seemed to materialize silently at every turn. Even when he attempted to flee, snowdrifts appeared where none had been before. Paths curved impossibly, and a low hum, barely perceptible, threaded through the trees, compelling him to return. He described the psychological weight of the household, a constant pressure that distorted his perception and fractured his memory, leaving him uncertain which decisions were his and which were imposed by the family's influence. When he finally emerged, hours later, or perhaps days, the transformation was already evident. He moved hesitantly, as though every step required approval, his eyes haunted by the patterns he had witnessed, and his mind shadowed by the knowledge that the Blackwoods could reach him anywhere. Stories like Samuel's circulated quietly among the locals, half believed and half feared, reinforcing the unspoken understanding that the family's power was absolute, not through violence alone, but through the relentless shaping of reality and perception. The hollow was no longer simply a house or property. It had become an active, sentient extension of the Blackwoods' will, a place where the human mind could be bent, broken, and rewritten according to their design, ensuring that even those who escaped physically carried the invisible chains of obedience and fear. In this way, the family's dominion expanded quietly yet inexorably, leaving a trail of minds forever altered, each story a testament to a psychological control system that operated beyond law, morality, or human comprehension. By the spring of 1925, the Blackwoods escalated their mastery from manipulation and terror to what could only be described as the complete erasure of an outsider's existence, a chilling evolution of their control that left no witness, no trace, and no possibility of retrieval. The victim, a traveling merchant named Henry Caldwell, had attempted to survey the outskirts of the hollow, believing the stories of disappearances to be exaggerated folklore. On the first night of his intrusion, Caldwell reported hearing voices that mirrored his own thoughts, whispering doubts, fears, and half-truths that twisted his perception of reality, drawing him deeper into the house and toward the family. The children appeared again, silent and omnipresent, guiding him with imperceptible gestures, while the walls shifted around him, creating loops of hallways that denied any sense of direction. Mirrors reflected him performing actions he did not remember taking. Shadows moved independently, echoing commands he could neither resist nor comprehend. Over the following days, or perhaps hours, time had become meaningless. Caldwell's mind unraveled, his memories fracturing under the pressure of orchestrated disorientation. When neighbors ventured near the property, they found no sign of him, not a footprint, not a dropped item, nothing to suggest he had ever existed beyond the hollow's influence. Even letters he had sent prior to entering were returned unopened or altered in ways that made him appear never to have existed at all, erasing his presence from records, from town memory, and from perception itself. By now, the Blackwood's psychological dominion had achieved a terrifying perfection. They could manipulate reality so thoroughly that existence itself could be rewritten in service of their will, removing the notion of resistance entirely. The town slowly came to recognize this phenomenon, in hushed conversations, acknowledging the invisible architecture of control that extended beyond walls, beyond time, and beyond human comprehension. The Hollow had transformed into a sentient apparatus of dominion, an ecosystem in which the mind, the land, and the very perception of reality were all instruments of obedience, and those who trespassed were absorbed into it, either physically, mentally, or utterly erased. At this stage, the Blackwoods were no longer merely a family with dark practices. They had become a force, a living system of psychological terror that rewrote reality, bending law, memory, and even the concept of identity itself to ensure the continuation of their unchallenged dominion. By the summer of 1926, the town surrounding the Blackwoods Hollow had begun to bend subtly, almost imperceptibly, to the family's influence. A quiet complicity born from fear, fascination, and the unspoken understanding that resistance was not only futile, but dangerous. Local merchants, school teachers, and even the sheriff found themselves adjusting routines, curbing questions, and avoiding the edges of the property. Their behaviors guided less by explicit threats than by an almost instinctive awareness of the Hollow's dominion. Rumors spread silently, stories half-formed and whispered in hushed tones, creating a veil of secrecy that both protected and amplified the family's control. Outsiders who visited the town remarked on the odd rhythms of daily life. A clock that never kept the same time twice, meetings called and canceled at arbitrary hours, residents pausing mid-conversation as though listening for unseen instructions. Children on the streets would freeze, staring toward the Hollow, and even the wind seemed to carry subtle cues, a low hum threading through alleys and fields, shaping movement and thought without overt command. The Blackwoods had extended their psychological machinery beyond the Hollow itself, embedding it in the social fabric of the community, turning the entire town into an accomplice of silence and obedience. Every disappearance, every fractured memory, every subtle distortion of perception served as both warning and lesson, conditioning not only those who entered the Hollow, but those who observed it from the periphery. The townsfolk's complicity became a living testament to the family's reach. They did not need to enforce obedience through confrontation, for the mere presence of the Hollow combined with the invisible architecture of control ensured compliance, shaping thoughts, behaviors, and even morality in accordance with the Blackwood's designs. Fear became a currency, perception a weapon, and the town a quiet, reluctant partner in maintaining the secrecy and dominance of a family that had transcended ordinary law, ordinary morality, and even ordinary understanding. In this way, the Hollow's influence spread outward, a silent contagion of control and manipulation, leaving the surrounding landscape and all who inhabited it perpetually attuned to the invisible will of the Blackwoods, and reinforcing the terrifying truth that power over perception is the most absolute and insidious of all dominions. By the winter of 1927, the Blackwoods' influence had quietly infiltrated the town's structures of authority, extending their dominion into local government, law enforcement, and even the judiciary. A subtle corruption that left no evidence yet ensured complete control. Deputies, clerks, and councilmen found themselves inexplicably hesitant to investigate disappearances or question the family's movements, their decisions guided less by conscious choice than by a creeping, almost imperceptible pressure on thought and perception. Reports filed about strange occurrences or missing persons would vanish, altered, or redirected in ways that made them appear inconsequential or mistaken, while witnesses, neighbors, travelers, and even family members of the disappeared were subtly persuaded to doubt their own memories, convinced that nothing extraordinary had occurred. The Blackwoods accomplished this not through bribery or overt intimidation, but through the same psychological precision they applied within the Hollow, a combination of observation, suggestion, and manipulation that infiltrated thought patterns, planting ideas and shaping perceptions until compliance became instinctual. Meetings of the town council, once lively and contentious, grew strangely uniform. Decisions always seemed to align with an unspoken directive emanating from the edges of the Hollow. Officers dispatched to investigate complaints would report disorientation, lapses in memory, or an urgent sense to abandon their inquiries, phenomena dismissed as fatigue or coincidence, but always coinciding with proximity to the family's property. Even those who prided themselves on rationality and independence began to speak in measured tones, cautious of implying doubt or defiance. By now, the town functioned as an extension of the Blackwoods' control, a living network of observation, suggestion, and silent enforcement, ensuring that no law, rule, or official could challenge the Hollow without risking not only professional ruin, but psychological unraveling. This infiltration cemented the family's dominion beyond the physical boundaries of their home, creating a social and governmental ecosystem entirely subservient to their will. The terrifying lesson became clear. The Blackwoods' power was not merely contained within the walls of the Hollow, nor in the fear of its direct victims, but in the very structure of reality as perceived by the community, a dominion so complete that it left no room for dissent, skepticism, or escape. By the spring of 1928, the Blackwoods had begun to refine their methods, experimenting with the simultaneous manipulation of multiple outsiders, pushing the boundaries of perception, fear, and obedience to an unprecedented degree. Entire groups who wandered too close to the Hollow found themselves ensnared in a meticulously orchestrated psychological web. Pathways shifted beneath their feet. Subtle auditory cues guided their movements, and shadows conspired to mislead their eyes, creating a labyrinth that tested every instinct and decision. The family employed the children as extensions of their will, dispatching them with silent, precise signals that directed the captives' actions while simultaneously observing their reactions, noting patterns of fear, hesitation, and trust. Visitors often found themselves interacting with duplicates of the family members' gestures and words, never realizing that what they experienced was choreographed to fragment memory and perception, causing each person to question what was real and what was an illusion. Meals, conversations, and physical spaces became instruments of control, each designed to reinforce dependency, erode resistance, and instill a subtle yet inescapable sense of inevitability regarding the family's dominion. Even when groups attempted to coordinate or communicate, the Hollow's layout and the Blackwoods' strategic interventions ensured misalignment, confusion, and self-doubt, turning cooperation into chaos and fear into a weapon. Over time, the family began documenting reactions, noting the nuances of compliance, submission, and breakdown, treating the Hollow as both laboratory and theater, testing the limits of human psychology while embedding their authority ever more deeply into the minds of those who entered. The town, now accustomed to hearing only fragments of these disappearances, offered no interference, leaving the family free to perfect a system where multiple individuals could be broken simultaneously, each mind bending to the same invisible architecture of control, reinforcing the terrifying reality that within the Blackwoods' domain, perception itself was a pliable tool, reality was negotiable, and the line between victim and participant had vanished entirely, leaving only the inexorable influence of a family who had transcended ordinary dominion to become arbiters of existence itself. By the autumn of 1929, the Blackwoods' influence expanded beyond individuals to entire families who unwittingly crossed the thresholds of their hollow, drawing them into a sophisticated, insidious orchestration of control that left no mind, no relationship, and no memory untouched. A family traveling through the region for work or passage would find themselves subtly guided toward the hollow by altered trails, inexplicable delays, or uncanny coincidences that felt natural yet were orchestrated with precision. Once within the influence of the property, the family's routines, communication, and perception were systematically manipulated. Children would become mirrors of the Blackwoods' gestures and expressions. Adults misinterpret the environment, and disagreements would spiral into confusion as subtle cues from the hollow rewired their decision-making and fractured their unity. Meals, shared chores, even conversations were transformed into instruments of compliance, gradually shifting trust toward the family and away from each other, until obedience became instinctive and resistance inconceivable. Letters sent to friends or relatives might be mysteriously delayed, altered, or misinterpreted, further isolating the group and reinforcing the hollow's dominion. Observers from the town noted these family disappearances, but could neither intervene nor fully comprehend the subtlety of the manipulation. Fear and respect for the Blackwoods had been internalized into the town's very culture. By now, the hollow had become a crucible of transformation, bending the collective psyche, dissolving autonomy, and implanting loyalty that felt natural to those ensnared. Entire households emerged, or were allowed to leave, with their memories fractured, their relationships realigned to the Blackwoods' silent code, and their perception of reality subtly yet permanently altered, serving as living testaments to the family's unparalleled mastery over mind, will, and environment. In this terrifying expansion, it became clear that the Blackwoods' influence was no longer limited to isolated individuals. They had constructed a system capable of remaking human beings en masse, transforming visitors into compliant instruments of their unchallengeable authority, and leaving the region forever haunted by a power that acted invisibly yet irrevocably on every mind that dared approach the hollow. By the winter of 1930, it became chillingly evident that the Blackwoods had extended their methods of control inward, turning even their own family members into enforcers of the hollow's psychological dominion, a mechanism that ensured obedience was absolute and perpetual. The children, who had grown up within the house's labyrinthine corridors and shifting walls, were no longer innocent observers, but precise instruments of surveillance and manipulation, their every movement and gesture calibrated to influence the behavior of outsiders and weaker-willed family members alike. They learned early to recognize fear, hesitation, and resistance, to replicate or distort expressions, and to subtly guide the actions of others without detection. Adolescents, who might have resisted, were gradually indoctrinated through isolation, repetition, and the selective administration of reward and punishment, their moral compass redirected to align completely with the family's design. Even the adults within the hollow were subjected to this recursive system, subtly monitored and corrected through invisible signals and orchestrated circumstances that reinforced hierarchy and obedience, ensuring no deviation from the Blackwoods' will could go unnoticed. Letters, journal entries, and later fragmented testimonies revealed a systematic pattern. Every family member was trained to observe, report, and manipulate, creating a self-reinforcing network in which autonomy was progressively surrendered to collective control. This internalization of power transformed the household into an autonomous mechanism of dominance, capable of extending influence beyond its walls with terrifying precision. Outsiders entering the hollow were not merely observed, they were funneled through a living apparatus of enforcement, the family's own children and adults, serving simultaneously as guides, monitors, and psycho. logical operators, ensuring compliance before physical intervention was ever necessary. Over time, the recursive system became self-sustaining. Each generation of Blackwoods internalized the architecture of control so thoroughly that it operated instinctively, embedding fear, obedience, and altered perception into every interaction. By now, the Hollow had evolved into a complex organism, a living, breathing network of manipulation in which even the enforcers were bound by the same invisible threads they pulled on others, a terrifying ecosystem where power, perception, and reality were no longer separate, and the line between victim and agent had been erased entirely. By the spring of 1931, the first outside investigators, officials sent by neighboring counties to probe reports of disappearances and odd occurrences, found themselves ensnared in the Blackwood's invisible web, their training and experience rendered meaningless by the Hollow's subtle yet absolute psychological architecture. Detectives, social workers, and even clergy reported an overwhelming sense of disorientation upon approaching the property. Maps seemed to mislead, trails shifted unexpectedly, and familiar landmarks appeared distorted or altogether absent, as though the very landscape was reshaping itself to serve the family's will. Once inside the Hollow's boundaries, time itself fractured. Hours could stretch into days or collapse into minutes, leaving observers unable to establish a coherent timeline, their memories fragmented almost immediately after each encounter. The children and carefully indoctrinated adults moved like specters, subtly guiding, observing, and influencing every decision, creating the impression of randomness while ensuring investigators followed predetermined paths. Investigators described an oppressive awareness that their own thoughts were no longer entirely their own. Fleeting impulses, doubts, and hesitations seemed to originate outside themselves, nudging them toward actions that favored the Blackwoods' control, while resistance was met not with physical force, but with an ever-present creeping psychological pressure that made defiance feel increasingly futile. Notes, reports, and even personal recollections of these investigators were later found altered, incomplete, or mysteriously lost, reinforcing the impression that the family's influence extended beyond the Hollow itself, bending external reality to protect and perpetuate their dominion. It became evident that no formal authority could withstand this system. The Blackwoods had constructed a dominion so precise and comprehensive that it captured not only individuals but institutions, memory, and evidence, creating a vacuum in which disappearances and anomalies were rendered invisible to all but those who had already been ensnared. By this point, the Hollow was not merely a house or a family property. It was a living strategic apparatus, extending its reach through perception, thought, and social structures alike, ensuring that any attempt to challenge the Blackwoods' absolute power would be anticipated, redirected, and neutralized before it could manifest, leaving only the chilling certainty that reality itself bowed to their will. By the autumn of 1932, the Blackwoods escalated their operation, targeting entire traveling groups, families, merchants, and itinerant workers, effectively consolidating control over a broader swath of the region, transforming the Hollow into a nexus of psychological dominion that spanned miles beyond its physical boundaries. Trails that had once been neutral became conduits of manipulation. Guides appeared who were in fact agents of the family. Casual detours became deliberate, and natural obstacles were subtly arranged to disorient and corral groups toward the property. Once within range, the Blackwoods' perfected system of observation, suggestion, and subtle orchestration fractured collective reasoning, sowing confusion, distrust, and fear among even the most cohesive groups. Adults found themselves questioning each other's perceptions. Children, either coerced or preconditioned, acted with uncanny precision to redirect behavior without overt instruction. And the Hollow itself, its shifting walls, distorted corridors, and labyrinthine basement, amplified every misstep, hesitation, and doubt, converting the environment into a weapon. Letters or messages intended for outside contacts were intercepted, altered, or delayed, isolating the victims further and reinforcing the sense that reality outside the hollow was untrustworthy. Groups attempting to resist were slowly manipulated into compliance. Their resistance eroded not through violence, but through a combination of orchestrated fear, fatigue, and the psychological weight of seeing their own thoughts mirrored and distorted by the family's operatives. Over time, the Blackwoods created a feedback loop. Each group brought under their sway became both evidence of their mastery and a new cohort of unwitting participants, further entrenching the family's influence in the surrounding region. By now, the hollow functioned not merely as a home or a lair, but as the central node of a sprawling psychological network, bending entire communities, controlling memory, perception, and behavior, and leaving the horrifying certainty that anyone who ventured too close risked assimilation into a system where autonomy, identity, and reality itself were subordinate to the unyielding will of the Blackwoods. By the winter of 1933, the Blackwoods' manipulations had begun to leave permanent, almost imperceptible marks on the town's social and cultural memory, embedding the family's influence into traditions, stories, and unwritten codes that would persist for generations. Local festivals, weekly markets, and religious gatherings subtly shifted in timing and ritual, aligning with the rhythms dictated by the hollow, while behaviors once considered spontaneous became patterned responses to invisible cues. Parents unconsciously taught their children cautionary tales in hushed tones, stories of the hollow and the family's unseen dominion that carried lessons not of morality, but of submission, obedience, and the inexplicable power of the Blackwoods. Residents spoke in coded language, anecdotes loaded with metaphor, hinting at disappearances and unnatural occurrences, their memories carefully curated to maintain secrecy while simultaneously reinforcing fear and respect. Even humor and gossip were shaped by the hollow, with jesters and storytellers unconsciously exaggerating the family's capabilities, creating a folklore in which the Blackwoods were omnipresent, omniscient, and untouchable. Outsiders, if they lingered long enough, sensed these distortions subtly, a community seemingly harmonious on the surface, yet infused with an undercurrent of hyper-awareness, caution, and collective complicity. Scholars or investigators who later attempted to reconstruct events found a web of fragmented, contradictory recollections, evidence of a population whose collective memory had been warped to protect the family's dominion. Over time, the town itself became an instrument of control, a living archive of obedience and manipulation that operated without direct oversight, preserving the hollow's influence even in the absence of the family's immediate presence. In this way, the Blackwoods ensure that their power would persist beyond direct encounters. Social behaviors, local myths, and communal memory became self-reinforcing mechanisms, perpetuating fear, shaping perception, and maintaining dominance in a system so subtle, so all-encompassing, that the line between reality and legend blurred entirely, leaving the horrifying truth that the hollow's reach was not just physical or psychological, but cultural, embedding the Blackwoods' control into the very consciousness of the town itself. By the spring of 1934, whispers of rival families and outsiders attempting to infiltrate or challenge the hollow began to surface, though few dared approach openly, and even fewer survived the subtle, omnipresent defenses of the Blackwoods' dominion. Those who attempted to probe the family's operations found themselves ensnared not by brute force, but by the meticulously calibrated system of psychological traps, spatial disorientation, and social manipulation that had matured over decades. Guides, neighbors, and seemingly innocent passers-by were agents of observation, conveying information to the family while subtly redirecting intruders' paths, conversations, and suspicions. Attempts to gather evidence, form alliances, or recruit local assistance invariably ended in confusion. Trusted accomplices inexplicably vanished, records disappeared or were altered, and even well-planned interventions faltered under the weight of subtle, insidious influence. Rival families found their own members doubting each other, unable to distinguish between genuine intent and the manipulations of the hollow, and many withdrew, claiming the region itself was cursed or inexplicably dangerous. Outsiders who persisted reported unexplainable phenomena: hallways that shifted when unobserved, doors that led to unexpected locations, and sounds that seemed to mimic their own thoughts, reinforcing paranoia and fear. The Blackwoods, observing each attempt, treated it as an experiment, recording reactions, adjusting the environment, and refining methods to counter collective resistance, making the hollow not merely a home or lair, but a strategic laboratory for social and psychological dominance. By now, any attempt to challenge the family's authority carried the dual risk of immediate danger and long-term cognitive corruption, demonstrating that the hollow's power extended beyond physical control to manipulation of trust, perception, and alliance itself. The terrifying reality was that the Blackwoods had created an ecosystem in which even opposition became a tool for deepening their control, transforming resistance into evidence of their superiority and embedding fear so thoroughly that the mere attempt to rival them often ensured submission. By the autumn of 1935, the Blackwoods had begun incorporating subtle rituals into daily life within the hollow and the surrounding town, using repetition, symbolism, and carefully timed ceremonies to deepen psychological conditioning and enforce obedience without overt coercion. These rituals were almost imperceptible to the casual observer: the ringing of a bell at a specific hour, the arrangement of objects in a room, or the cadence of meals and work schedules, all meticulously calibrated to evoke compliance, reinforce hierarchy, and manipulate perception. Townsfolk, whether aware or not, began aligning their routines with these unseen rhythms, their behaviors increasingly reflecting patterns instilled by the family's influence. Visitors were drawn into symbolic acts that seemed benign but functioned as exercises in submission, testing their responses to authority, expectation, and isolation, while the children and indoctrinated adults observed, guided, and subtly corrected deviations. Even leisure and social interaction were weaponized. Songs, stories, and games contained cues and micro-instructions designed to erode resistance, instill loyalty, and subtly fracture memory, ensuring that the family's control became internalized, automatic, and unquestioned. Over time, these rituals created a feedback loop. Townsfolk unconsciously reinforced the patterns imposed by the hollow, which in turn allowed the Blackwoods to extend their reach without appearing present, their dominion sustained by culture, habit, and unspoken compulsion. Outsiders who observed or participated often felt an inexplicable sense of alignment, unease, or inevitability, as if the world itself were orchestrated to guide them toward submission, eroding skepticism before any overt threat could be applied. By this stage, the hollow had evolved from a home to a living system of dominance, a subtle architecture of mind and behavior in which reality itself was bent to reinforce the Blackwoods' authority. Every action, perception, and reaction became a tool of conditioning, a means of consolidating control, leaving a terrifying clarity. In the presence of the hollow, human will was never entirely free, and the family's influence could reach even those who thought themselves vigilant and independent, bending thought, choice, and memory to its insidious design. By the winter of 1936, it became painfully evident that the Blackwoods' manipulations were leaving enduring psychological scars on anyone who entered the hollow, even briefly, creating effects that persisted long after individuals had physically escaped the property. Survivors described fragmented memories, recurring nightmares, and a persistent sense of being observed, as though invisible eyes continued to track their thoughts and actions. Trust in their own perception eroded, leaving them unable to distinguish between past experiences, imagined threats, and subtle manipulations imposed by the hollow, a cognitive disorientation that often lasted months or years. Families reported tension and paranoia spilling into daily life, siblings and spouses questioning each other's motives, and minor disagreements igniting disproportionate fear or suspicion, a direct reflection of the fracturing that occurred inside the Blackwood's domain. Even those who never interacted directly with the family or Hollow began to internalize its influence through community tales, coded warnings, and the behavioral patterns instilled in neighbors who had returned from the property, ensuring that the psychological reach of the Blackwoods extended far beyond immediate contact. Medical professionals and psychologists of the time documented cases of inexplicable anxiety, acute hypervigilance, and disorientation, but the absence of tangible evidence rendered these reports anecdotal and easily dismissed by outsiders, further insulating the family's operations from scrutiny. The Hollow's effects were cumulative, layering subtle distortions of reality, perception, and trust upon each new visitor, creating a population increasingly conditioned to accept incomprehensible phenomena as normal and reinforcing the family's unchallenged authority. By now, it was clear that the Blackwood's mastery was not environmental or social. It was neurological and emotional, crafting a system that could infiltrate thought itself, leaving traces that no amount of distance or reflection could fully erase. The terrifying truth was unavoidable. Proximity to the Hollow, even fleeting, was enough to permanently alter cognition, fracture memory, and instill a deep-seated obedience and wariness, making every mind that had brushed against the Blackwood's dominion a living extension of their power, bound forever to the invisible architecture of control that defined the Hollow. By the spring of 1937, the Blackwoods escalated their experimentation, turning to coordinated group behavior to test the limits of collective psychological compliance, effectively transforming the Hollow into a laboratory for social engineering. Visitors, employees, and even local townsfolk were subtly guided into orchestrated scenarios that appeared spontaneous, yet were meticulously designed to provoke specific reactions, measure obedience, and exploit weaknesses in perception, memory, and trust. Families traveling through the region were often intercepted by pre-positioned guides, diverted into patterns that seemed accidental but were actually calibrated exercises in conformity and suggestion. Within the Hollow, the children and indoctrinated adults directed interactions like conductors of an invisible orchestra, ensuring that responses aligned with predetermined outcomes. Disobedience or hesitation was met not with direct punishment, but through subtle social isolation, misdirection, and carefully choreographed fear, making resistance increasingly uncomfortable and psychologically unsustainable. Even those who believed themselves astute and skeptical found themselves subtly guided, their actions reshaped by imperceptible nudges and the weight of collective expectation. Reports recovered decades later revealed that these exercises were often repeated, with variables adjusted to maximize compliance and uncover new methods for eroding autonomy. The Hollow functioned as both stage and instrument. Walls, corridors, and ambient sounds were manipulated in concert with human actors to produce predictable emotional and cognitive responses, reinforcing the Blackwood's dominion while deepening the sense of inevitability for those caught within the system. By now, the family had perfected a recursive process. Each experiment not only ensured obedience but trained new generations of participants, both within and outside the family, to serve as instruments of control, propagating influence far beyond the Hollow's physical confines. The horrifying clarity emerged that the Blackwood's mastery was no longer merely personal or local. It had become a replicable system for dominating thought, behavior, and perception, demonstrating that even the most cohesive and aware groups could be dismantled, redirected, and absorbed into the architecture of the Hollow, without ever recognizing the manipulation until it was too late. By the late summer of 1938, cracks began to appear in the Blackwood's carefully maintained control when a rare outsider, a traveling ethnographer with extensive experience in remote communities and psychological observation, started to perceive the subtle distortions that had gone unnoticed by so many before. Unlike most visitors, he questioned inconsistencies, mapped the hollow's shifting corridors, and recorded patterns in social behavior, routines, and interactions that revealed a level of orchestration far beyond coincidence. His presence immediately altered the dynamics within the hollow. The children and indoctrinated adults reacted with a mixture of caution and controlled deception, their usual precision strained under the weight of unanticipated scrutiny. The ethnographer noted the recursive nature of control, how the family constantly adjusted environmental cues, social prompts, and psychological pressures to maintain dominance, and began piecing together a framework of influence that extended across perception, memory, and collective behavior. Letters, journals, and recollections he gathered from townsfolk revealed a network of altered narratives, missing details, and unspoken compacts, all orchestrated to protect the Blackwood's authority. Yet his persistence introduced a variable the family had rarely encountered: sustained skepticism paired with methodical observation, which began to reveal vulnerabilities in the hollow's architecture of control. Even subtle behaviors, previously imperceptible, were now being recorded and analyzed, exposing patterns that the Blackwoods had relied upon to predict, manipulate, and neutralize outsiders. This rare breach of their system did not yet topple the family's power, but it demonstrated a critical truth. The hollow, for all its sophistication and terror, was not invincible, and even the most meticulously controlled, real entity could be interrogated, mapped, and challenged, though at immense personal risk. The ethnographer's discoveries marked the first step toward external awareness, a glimmer of hope that the mechanisms of fear, manipulation, and absolute control could one day be documented, understood, and perhaps resisted, exposing the terrifying complexity of the Blackwood's dominion to a world that had so far only glimpsed it through rumor, legend, and fractured memory. By the winter of 1939, the Blackwoods responded to the ethnographer's intrusion with a level of calculated aggression that revealed the full extent of their strategic mastery, blending environmental manipulation with psychological pressure to neutralize the threat without exposing the hollow to overt confrontation. Corridors were subtly rearranged, familiar pathways altered, and sounds were orchestrated to confuse and disorient, while residents, both indoctrinated and coerced, altered their behaviors to mislead and fragment the outsider's observations. The family introduced subtle social conflicts, carefully timed arguments, and cryptic conversations designed to sow doubt, induce paranoia, and force the ethnographer to question every assumption, every note he had meticulously recorded. Meals, gatherings, and routines were choreographed to produce fatigue and compliance, eroding concentration and resilience with the same precision used in earlier experiments. Even minor environmental cues, a misplaced object, an unexplained odor, a fleeting shadow, were deployed strategically, creating layers of uncertainty that made logical analysis almost impossible. Despite his experience, the ethnographer found himself caught in a web where every action seemed anticipated, every observation anticipated, and the hollow itself appeared to anticipate his methods of investigation, turning his rational tools into instruments of disorientation. Communication with the outside world became unreliable. Letters went missing or returned altered, local intermediaries were subtly influenced, and any attempt to verify facts externally was met with implausible delays or contradictory information. It was at this stage that the Blackwoods demonstrated a terrifying principle. Their control was not merely physical or social, but cognitive, bending perception and decision-making to their design. Every attempt to resist or expose the truth was converted into a test, a refinement, and an extension of their dominion, ensuring that the outsider became an unwitting participant in the very system he sought to document. By the end of this campaign, it was unmistakably clear that the hollow operated as a living instrument of manipulation, capable of bending the perceptions, behaviors, and even the reasoning of any intruder who dared to map its depths reinforcing the chilling reality that the Blackwood's reach extended beyond mere territory into the architecture of the mind itself. By the spring of 1940, the ethnographer's final attempts to escape the hollow revealed the terrifying duality of the Blackwood's power, omnipotent within their carefully controlled domain, yet bound by certain limitations once confronted with persistent external scrutiny. As he retraced his steps, mapping exits, hidden chambers, and the subtle behavioral cues embedded within the town, he realized that the family's dominion relied on the compliance of minds conditioned over generations, and that unpredictability, persistence, and analytical rigor could exploit fractures in their system. Yet even as he uncovered hidden passageways, secret observation points, and patterns of psychological manipulation designed to entrap visitors, every step outside the hollow's physical perimeter presented new challenges. Agents of the family had infiltrated neighboring communities, leaving him uncertain of whom to trust, while coded stories, rumors, and partial truths disseminated through the town created a cognitive fog, undermining his confidence in reality itself. The closer he came to exposing the Blackwood's mechanisms, the more sophisticated their countermeasures became. Misdirections, staged coincidences, and seemingly innocuous interactions warped into psychological tests, each designed to gauge his comprehension and resolve. Letters previously used to gather information were now weaponized to manipulate his sense of timing, presence, and expectations, illustrating the recursive precision of the hollow's reach. Yet, despite fatigue, confusion, and mounting fear, the ethnographer documented enough evidence, patterns of obedience, distortion, and control, to sketch the architecture of the hollow and its influence over both mind and town. In his final notes, he acknowledged a chilling truth. The Blackwood's power, though immense, depended upon secrecy, obedience, and the internalization of fear and exposure, even partial, threatened not only the family but the fragile ecosystem of psychological dominance they had cultivated. His escape, if it succeeded, would mark the first breach in decades, a glimpse into the mechanisms of a system designed to bend perception, memory, and trust, yet leaving the unsettling awareness that even knowledge of the hollow carried consequences, for the very act of understanding it risked becoming another vector of the Blackwood's influence. In the months following the ethnographer's partial exposure, the hollow began to reveal its true resilience and adaptability as the Blackwoods adjusted to the breach with a chilling blend of subtle intimidation, strategic silence, and social recalibration. Townsfolk who had interacted with the outsider were quietly scrutinized, their routines and behaviors analyzed, while small, almost imperceptible punishments and corrections ensured that no lasting alliances or coordinated resistance could form. Rumors, carefully seeded by the family, painted the ethnographer as unreliable, mentally unstable, or misled, preemptively discrediting his observations before they could gain traction. Simultaneously, the Blackwoods reinforced the hollow's internal structure. Corridors were altered, hidden chambers strengthened, and rituals intensified to restore the sense of inevitability and control that had been momentarily challenged. New generations of children, already steeped in the family's patterns, assumed increasingly sophisticated roles in observation and enforcement, while previously indoctrinated adults were subtly retrained, their compliance reinforced through a combination of reward, subtle fear, and social expectation. The town itself, once vulnerable to rumor or scrutiny, became a buffer, its residents unwittingly perpetuating the family's influence while protecting the hollow from external examination. The ethnographer's notes, smuggled to distant colleagues, were met with skepticism or disbelief, illustrating the terrifying fact that the Blackwood's dominion relied not only on direct manipulation, but on controlling the narrative itself, ensuring that even evidence could be neutralized, reframed, or ignored. By this point, the hollow had proven a living, adaptive system of dominance, capable of absorbing intrusion, recalibrating its defenses, and extending influence far beyond its physical boundaries. The The Blackwoods' mastery was complete, a terrifying architecture of mind, perception, and social control, resilient to outside intervention and yet eerily dependent on secrecy and subtle obedience, a reminder that even the most sophisticated systems of control are maintained not by brute force alone, but by the careful orchestration of fear, trust, and complicity. Decades later, long after the ethnographer's brief intrusion, the legacy of the Blackwoods and the Hollow's enduring influence remained woven into the fabric of the region, a silent, almost invisible force shaping behavior, perception, and memory across generations. The town, now largely abandoned, still held echoes of ritualized movement, patterns of dominance, and invisible hierarchies that had once governed every thought and action within the Hollow. Descendants of the indoctrinated families carried fragments of the Blackwoods system in subtle habits, fears, and ways of thinking, perpetuating obedience and conformity without realizing its origin. Local legends spoke of a family that bent reality, stories recounted in hushed tones, half-remembered and distorted by time, warning outsiders of a place where perception itself could be manipulated and free will subtly eroded. Anthropologists, historians, and the rare, curious traveler who ventured near the Hollow reported unease, disorientation, and inexplicable cognitive dissonance, sensations that mirrored the experiences of those who had once lived under the Blackwoods' direct control. The Hollow, though empty of overt human activity, remained a repository of influence, a psychological architecture capable of shaping minds through suggestion, memory, and the weight of myth. Its power endured not through overt violence or domination, but through subtle manipulation, the internalization of fear, and the reproduction of ritualized obedience, a terrifying testament to the ways human systems of control can outlive their creators. The Blackwoods experiment had transcended their own lifetimes, proving that mastery over perception, memory, and social structure could persist quietly, invisibly yet undeniably, and that the most profound horror is not always what is seen, but what lingers unseen, shaping thought and behavior, long after the architects are gone. In the silence of the Hollow, in the rhythm of abandoned streets and the shadows cast by long-forgotten walls, one truth remained. The Blackwoods had not merely ruled a family or a town. They had engineered a system that survived, and anyone who glimpses its design can never unsee it, forever altered, forever aware of the fragile line between freedom and subtle, insidious control.